Chapters 6 and 7 have focused on feeding information over to the brain, specifically from afferent nerves that are stimulated by different forms of energy, whether it be light, vibrations, temperature, pain, or any of the other senses. We find that information is then transported over to the brain through the spinal cord, but then the brain has to do something about it. And this is the chapter that will tell us how the brain responds to the stimulation. Please note that the entire chapter will focus on sensorimotor, which is the critical contribution of sensory input that would eventually guide a motor output. That is to say, the senses prompt our brain to respond accordingly. This short module will focus on the three principles of sensorimotor function. Please note that the understanding of the hierarchical organization from previous chapters would be helpful in understanding the response from the top bottom. That is to say, from the brain to our muscles. You may remember the example used in chapter 7 about the hierarchical organization. Looking at the highest level, which would be the equivalent of the CEO of a company, we're talking about the association cortex. You may remember that when looking at the occipital lobe, which is the lobe in the cortex that's associated with vision, that is not where vision stops. This is the beginning of a ripple effect that makes use of the temporal lobe and the parietal lobe. These two are considered association cortex for the occipital lobe, which is for vision. At the lowest level, we would have the receptor cells, and following the example of the vision, that would be our eyes. Please note that we are now no longer going from the bottom up, that is to say, from receptors to the brain. Now we're working our way back down from the association cortex, that is the highest level, to now the muscles. The reason why the muscles are now involved is because it typically is required to take us away from any danger or to allow us to engage in something that would be stimulating pleasantly. That's where we look at the fight or flight response. It is also important for us to note and keep in mind the parallel structure, that is, that the signals flow between levels over multiple pathways, and this is what allows our brain and many of our senses to be quite resilient. The motor output, which is a behavior, movement, is guided by the sensory input. Our ability to locate where the object or where the sound is coming from allows us to then make an appropriate response to that threat. It is also important to note that the learning changes the nature and locus of sensory motor control. By locus, we are talking about a particular position, point, or place. Think of the time you began texting, or think of someone that has not texted before, and pay attention to how slow their behavior tends to be. They may have time locating where a specific key is. They may have difficulty moving their fingers in relation to the position on the screen. However, with more and more time and more practice, we find that this response, which is now learned, is no longer requiring all these resources. Now it becomes a lot more automatic. This would be an example of how our brain begins to be no longer as crucial as it was at the beginning. Another example of this could be how when you started driving, perhaps you used to put your hands on the 2 o'clock and the 10 a.m. mark of the steering wheel, and you would adjust and be perhaps quite tense. But with more time and with more practice and with more miles under your belt, you started getting comfortable with it, perhaps to the point where you're not able to eat while you drive, maybe apply makeup, and many other things. Well, that's not necessarily recommended. We do find that this shows us how there's a minimization of higher level involvement in minor tasks. That is to say that our brain is no longer as active as it was at the beginning. Now it becomes perhaps second nature, and it facilitates our behaviors. Comparing it to the business model, this would make our body a lot more functional and a lot more effective. This figure shows us the general model of the sensorimotor system. Please note that the hierarchical structure is present here with a functional segregation of the levels. We have the secondary motor cortex up on top right here. You have the association, that's at the very top, primary, brainstem motor nuclei, and then the spinal motor circuits that would eventually be sent out so that we could flex our muscles or move out of the way. It's also important for us to note how similar this is to the sensory system hierarchy. In sensory systems, the information mainly flows up through the hierarchy, and that would actually be sending its way up. These are feedback circuits. In sensorimotor system, the information mainly flows down, and that would be again a response from the brain down to the motor response. I've used this example before, and I'd like you to keep that in mind, whereas if you have a mosquito or an insect on your left arm, and then that is enough to make you aware of its presence on your left arm, you would then send a message over to your brain through the spinal cord. The brain would then assess the threat. If it is just a fruit fly, it may not respond in a very aggressive way. But if you find that it is something that could harm you or could hurt you, we could then see a more aggressive response, and that would be a response that would come down from the association cortex, secondary, primary, brainstem motor nuclei, eventually the spinal motor circuits that would act in response to that threat.